crushingly cold in New York, so I'm gonna go to a man-made lake in the middle of a rainforest with container ships on it. This is the Panama Canal.
And this is about how building the Panama Canal was an incredible pain in the ass because of geography. I think what I didn't quite understand about the Panama Canal until I actually got onto it on a boat. It is the most spectacular mashup of both nature and capitalism, all just fused into the same place. Monkeys and alligators and bugs and birds. There are some rainforest vultures right here eating a dead iguana. That's wild. Incredible tropical plants.
My arm is like smaller than this piece of bamboo down here. Look at all this shit.
With just gigantic container ships rolling through. That last boat had a bunch of cars on it. Cement mixer, buses and shit. It's hard to really like wrap your head around how big these ships are until you're like in a tiny little boat right up next to it. It's so cool. You think about how much of the world's commerce passes through here. All your like stupid t-shirts you bought at H&M that are made in China.
And when I arrived in Panama City, I was hell-bent on getting an aerial shot to show you that the canal isn't so much a canal, but a bizarre-looking man-made lake. But after I got these shots of the city, my drone decided it didn't like Panama anymore.
I got all the way to Panama. I rented a car. I drove somewhere to shoot some drone footage of the lake. And then this thing is like having a seizure. I updated the firmware. We're supposed to be a team.
With the drone dead and me too cheap to splurge on a helicopter, I decided to do it on the ground.
I texted a random number on WhatsApp. I ended up on this boat. Nobody really speaks English. We're just going through the rainforest on a boat. Technically, this is the Panama Canal still, or it's the lake that's part of it. It's so cool. This lake in the middle of the rainforest. The container ship, that's what I'm fucking talking about. I gotta thank DJI for motivating me to take the boat. Thanks to DJI for giving me a great boat trip.
All in all, it takes about 8 to 10 hours for one of these ships to pass through the canal. The journey is not easy, and inside each of these containers lie untold riches. One single mistake in the Panama Canal, and the global economy could come completely off the rails. The ship's captain gets swapped out for a local Panamanian captain just to navigate the canal. And even with his help, on the bigger ships, it's still tugboats that drag the ship through.
To put it in perspective, the drive between the Pacific side and the Atlantic side of Panama is only about an hour. It's really not very far at all. But as you can see, it's got some pretty intense topography.
But the real reason the Panama Canal is such a clusterfuck is the locks. You know those chambers of water that move the ships up and down to be at the right sea level or whatever? Yeah, tourists like to go visit them, and they might be a marvel of engineering or whatever, but they're really a patchwork solution. And in case you couldn't tell by the fact that the canal is shaped like a weird lake, not a canal, things really didn't go as planned when they were excavating the canal, but let's get into why.
This is a map of the Americas, and ever since the 1500s, the 1600s, the Europeans realized that sailing from Europe to the Pacific was an incredible pain in the ass, because you had to sail all the way around here like a chode. And so starting early, hundreds of years before the Panama Canal was ever attempted to be built at all, people started hypothesizing what are some over-the-land routes we could create so you don't have to sail all the way around the Americas. And obviously, what's called the Isthmus of Panama, this tiny little strip of land here, stood out as being the obvious point that would be easiest to cross the Americas. Now, this is a little more complicated than it might seem because of something called the Continental Divide. There's mountains literally running all the way up and down, north and south, the entire thing. And if you look really closely, you'll see that Panama is no exception. It's also got some intense topography. It's mountainous. Now, if you zoom in here just on the topographical map of Panama, you'll see that while there are mountains that span pretty much the entire country, in the middle here, there is a relatively low elevation. And that's where the Panama Canal is. But I chose my words carefully. Relatively low elevation. It's still mountainous. And there's another catch. If we zoom in on this area of relatively low elevation before the Panama Canal was built, you can see that the Chagres River, that's roughly how you pronounce it, runs through this whole area of low elevation. There are still mountains, the Continental Divide, going along it, and there's this whole network of rivers which ultimately dumps out into the Atlantic. On top of that, all this shit is rainforest, which means that for a good chunk of the year, the rainy season, it rains a boatload. With all these mountains, all this water gets directed into this river system, and when this happens, the level of the river can raise sometimes by up to like 10 meters. It's crazy. Which means that excavating this relatively low elevation area in the Isthmus of Panama is actually a huge pain in the ass. Now, the first attempt at building out the Panama Canal was from a French gentleman named Ferdinand de Lesseps. He's the same guy who successfully got the Suez Canal built. You know, the Suez Canal. Before the Suez Canal came along, if you wanted to sail from somewhere over here in the Indian Ocean, maybe up here to the Mediterranean, or maybe to England or the Netherlands or something like that, you would have had to sail all the way around Africa like a fucking chode, and it would have taken forever, and it would have been a huge pain in the ass. And so what they did is they dug a canal right here to connect the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. But you can see, even though it's 120 miles long, the entire thing goes from sea to sea. You just can sail right through. You know, it takes like 12, 16 hours or something like that. It's shallow, you gotta go slow, but you can sail uninterrupted all the way through from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, thanks to the Suez Canal. Thanks to Ferdinand de Lesseps, he wanted to build the Panama Canal in the same way. He wanted you to just be able to sail all the way through from the Pacific to the Atlantic or vice versa without having to stop, without needing locks. And there's a good reason for this. It's because locks are a huge pain in the ass. Locks are a lot more expensive to build. They have an operational cost, which means that even after you build them, you then have to be operating them constantly, filling them up, and then draining them of water to bring ships up and down to the different levels of sea. And they also require a reservoir of water, which is a limitation on how many ships you can pass through, especially if Panama has a drought like they have in recent years. And this whole process of having ships raise up or drop down in the locks takes time. Even though the Panama Canal is about 40% the length of the Suez Canal, it really isn't dramatically shorter in terms of time to cross it, and that's because a lot of that time gets wasted in locks, waiting for them to slowly fill up or drain. So it was a valiant effort for this guy, Ferdinand, to try to dig out the Panama Canal without needing locks. Starting in 1881, 12 years after the Suez Canal was completed, this guy started building the Panama Canal, trying to excavate it to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic without the use of locks, and it didn't work. He wasted a lot of time. He wasted a lot of probably his own, but definitely other people's money too, investors' money. And also, a lot of workers died trying to build the Panama Canal, and it didn't work. He went bankrupt, and the Suez Canal was the only canal that this guy made successfully. And the reason it was so difficult, in addition to the elevation, which meant more excavating had to be done, during the rainy season, the whole canal would be gushing with huge volumes of water, and a lot of times all the excavation they were doing would just cave in, and their work would fail over and over. They keep digging, it keeps caving in, the whole thing's a mess. Not to mention that this is a tropical rainforest full of venomous snakes and mosquitoes with malaria and yellow fever, and assholes like this guy who you really can't count on to be helpful to you at all. He's really working against you in a lot of cases. And the workers who are like always probably waiting around in shallow, warm, tropical water, they found countless ways to like get sick and die or get injured and die, and the entire project failed. And so the Americans, led by Theodore Roosevelt, came in, and they decided to go the more complicated way, dam up the Chagres River right here in Gatun, put a giant dam here. That's a pretty sick dam, right? Turn all this into a gigantic man-made lake in the middle of the rainforest, and have 3 locks, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 on either side, and allow ships to pass up and down. And by 1914, after over 30 years of attempting to build it, the Panama Canal was finally ready to go.